What would you do if you spent your entire life apologizing for something you never did? If the person who destroyed your family was the same person who tucked you in at night, who dried your tears, who told you, with a soft voice and kind eyes, that none of it was your fault? Sarah Harlow was 9 years old when her mother died, and for 16 years she carried the belief that she was the one responsible, that her words, spoken in innocence, had set everything in motion. She was humiliated in front of everyone she had ever known, her name, her pain, and her private battles, exposed in a crowded room by the one person she should have been able to trust. And still she said nothing. Still she stayed. Still she believed. She built her entire life around that guilt, and around the woman who had carefully placed it inside her. But secrets buried deep enough have a way of finding the surface. And when a dying woman finally chose to speak after 20 years of silence, everything Sarah thought she knew about that night, about her mother, about the people she trusted, and about herself, was about to collapse. This is the story of what was taken from her, and of what she found when she stopped believing the lie. The night of Thomas Harlow's 50th birthday party was the kind of night that made Harlow Estate look like something out of a painting. The lanterns along the front porch cast a warm amber glow across the yard. The long tables were draped in white linen, and every family of consequence in Crestfield County had come dressed in their finest. The air smelled like jasmine and grilled meat, and the particular kind of pride that old money carries without even trying. Sarah was 17 years old that night. She stood near the edge of the main room in a pale blue dress her father had bought her for the occasion, holding a glass of sparkling water she hadn't touched, watching the evening unfold around her like a performance she hadn't been given a script for. She had learned over the years how to occupy a room without really being in it, how to smile at the right moment, nod at the right moment, and disappear into the background the way wallpaper does, present but unremarkable. She was good at it by then. She had been practicing since she was 9 years old. Across the room, her father stood at the center of a circle of men, ranchers, lawyers, old friends, laughing at something one of them had said, his silver hair catching the light. Thomas Harlow was a handsome man, broad-shouldered and deliberate in the way he moved, the kind of man who filled a room simply by being in it. Sarah watched him and felt the familiar ache she never quite had words for. Love and distance wound together so tightly she couldn't separate one from the other anymore. And then she heard it. Not all at once. In pieces, the way a song reaches you from another room. Fragments of melody that slowly assemble into something recognizable. Diane's voice, low and warm and carrying just far enough. Sarah turned her head. Diane Colwell stood with a small group of women near the fireplace, one hand resting on the arm of Margaret Price, the most well-connected socialite in the county, and the other pressed flat against her own chest in that gesture she had, the one that always signaled deep and reluctant concern. She was dressed impeccably as always, dark green silk, pearl earrings, the picture of gracious restraint. The words came in fragments. Emotional instability. A therapist, you know, for years now. The guilt over her mother. It never really left her. We do what we can. The room didn't go loud. It went quiet. That particular quiet that spreads through a gathering like cold water, the moment everyone realizes something private has become public. Heads turned, slowly, the way people turn when they don't want to be seen turning. Eyes found Sarah with the practiced subtlety of people who had grown up learning how to stare without staring. Sarah stood completely still. She understood in that moment exactly what was happening. Not because it was new, but because this time it was in front of everyone. Every family she had grown up around, every name that mattered in Crestfield County. Diane had chosen this room, this night, this audience with the same careful precision she applied to everything. Sarah looked across the room at her father. Thomas had heard. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the way his laugh had died mid-breath. He turned his head. and for one suspended second his eyes almost met hers. Then they dropped to the floor. That was the moment. Not the words, not the staring, not the silence. The moment her own father looked at the ground rather than at her. That was the thing that would stay with Sarah long after the lanterns were extinguished and the white linen tablecloths were folded away. Caleb appeared at her side. He was the boy from the Mercer ranch next door, broad and quiet and steady in a way that had always made Sarah feel slightly less alone. He reached for her hand. She pulled away. She didn't want to be comforted. She didn't want to be seen needing comfort. She wanted to be made of stone. She wanted to be somewhere else entirely, somewhere no one knew her name or her mother's name, or the story Diane had been quietly telling about her for years. She set her untouched glass down on the nearest table and walked toward the hallway with her chin level and her eyes forward, the way she had taught herself to move through rooms that felt like traps. Nobody stopped her. Nobody followed. She sat on the back steps of the estate for the rest of the evening, listening to the party continue without her, watching the stars come out one by one over the dark fields of Harlow land. The night was warm. The jasmine still smelled sweet. And somewhere inside the house, Diane Colwell was still talking. But this story doesn't begin at 17. It begins 8 years earlier, on a warm afternoon in early summer, when the ranch was still golden and Sarah's mother was still alive, and the word betrayal hadn't entered Sarah's vocabulary yet. It begins the way all devastating things begin, quietly and with a smile. Chapter 2. The afternoon that changed everything. To understand what Diane took from Sarah, you first have to understand what Sarah had. Harlow Estate in the summer was the kind of place that made children believe the world was essentially good. The land stretched out in every direction, rolling pastures, old oak trees, a creek that ran cold and clear along the eastern boundary of the property. The main house was large without being cold, filled with the particular warmth of a family that had lived in the same walls for generations. Screen doors that creaked, a kitchen that always smelled of something on the stove, boots lined up on the porch in order of size. Sarah was 9 years old and she knew every inch of it. Her mother Helen was the kind of woman who made a house feel inhabited rather than merely occupied. She was warm in the unself-conscious way of people who don't know they're being watched, who laugh too loudly at their own jokes, and leave flowers in mismatched jars on every windowsill. She sang while she worked. She remembered the names of every ranch hand's children. She had a way of looking at you, fully, without distraction, that made you feel like the most important person in whatever room you shared. Thomas loved her. That was never the question. He loved her the way proud men love things they believe they've earned, completely, and with the possessiveness he would never have recognized in himself as a flaw. And Diane had been there since before Sarah could remember. Diane Colwell had grown up in Crestfield County, the daughter of a family that had once had money and then didn't. She was elegant in the way of women who have learned to perform elegance rather than inherit it, precise in her dress, careful in her speech, always slightly more composed than the situation required. She had known Thomas since they were young, since before Helen. As a child, Sarah had never questioned Diane's presence. She was simply part of the furniture of their lives, at Sunday dinners, at holiday gatherings, at the quiet weekday afternoons when she would stop by with something she had baked or a piece of county gossip she thought Thomas would find amusing. She had her own chair at the Harlow dinner table. She knew where everything in the kitchen was kept. What Sarah didn't have the language for at 9 years old was the way Diane's eyes moved to Thomas whenever he entered a room. The half second of stillness before she rearranged her expression into something appropriate. The particular quality of her attention, focused and patient and unrelenting, that was less like friendship and more like vigil. Helen noticed. Helen had noticed for years. But Helen was a woman in a world where accusing a devoted family friend of obsession would have sounded like jealousy, and Thomas was a man who would have heard it exactly that way. So the summer continued, warm and golden, and Diane continued to smile, and the screen door continued to creak, and Sarah continued to believe that the world was essentially good. Until the afternoon in early July, when she wandered down the hall toward her mother's sitting room and pushed open the door that had been left slightly ajar. Helen was standing near the window with Raymond Cole's arms around her. Raymond was her father's closest friend, a rancher from the northern end of the county, broad and weathered, a man who had been at their table nearly as long as Diane had. His chin was resting on top of Helen's head. Helen's face was pressed against his shoulder. Her shoulders were shaking. She was crying. Sarah stood in the doorway and felt the floor shift beneath her. She was 9 years old. She did not have the framework to understand what comfort looked like between two adults who were not in love. She did not know that Raymond had stopped by that afternoon to check on Helen after a particularly cruel comment, delivered by Diane in the kitchen, in a soft voice at precisely the moment Raymond happened to be present. She did not know that Diane had engineered the moment with the patience of someone who had been waiting years for the right afternoon. All Sarah saw was her mother in another man's arms. She took a step back. The floorboard creaked. Helen looked up. Her eyes went wide. She pulled back from Raymond, started to say Sarah's name, but Sarah was already turning, already moving back down the hallway with her heart hammering and something cold and formless spreading through her chest. She didn't get far. Diane was in the hallway. She had come from the direction of the kitchen, which meant she had likely been standing just outside the sitting room moments before. She looked at Sarah's face, and something moved behind her eyes. Quick and controlled, there and gone before a child could name it. She knelt down. She was always good at that, coming down to Sarah's level, making herself feel safe and close. She tucked a strand of hair behind Sarah's ear and said very gently, "Your father deserves to know the truth, sweetheart. You love your father, don't you?" She didn't instruct. She didn't accuse. She simply asked a question and let a 9-year-old child do the rest. That evening after dinner, Sarah told her father what she had seen. She would spend the next 16 years wishing she hadn't. Thomas said nothing for a long moment. He set his fork down. He folded his napkin with the deliberate, careful movements of a man trying to keep himself very still. He sent Sarah to her room in a voice that left no room for questions. Sarah lay in her bed and listened to the sounds of the house below her. Voices, low, then raised, then low again. A door closing. Footsteps on the stairs. Then silence so complete it felt like a presence of its own. She fell asleep, waiting for it to end. In the morning, her mother was gone. The official account, as it was explained to Sarah over the following days in careful, measured language, was that Helen had fallen from the upper balcony in the night. An accident. The railing was old. The night was dark. And these things happen sometimes on old properties like Harlow Estate. Thomas accepted this, or he told himself he did. What nobody said, what hung in the air of every room in the house for weeks afterward, was that Thomas had confronted Helen that night, that voices had been raised, that Raymond Cole left Crestfield County within a week and never came back, that the balcony where Helen fell was one she had no particular reason to be standing on in the middle of the night. The adults of Crestfield County whispered about it for a season, the way communities whisper about things they don't want to examine too closely, and then they moved on. Sarah did not move on. Sarah was 9 years old, and she had told her father something that had started a chain of events that ended with her mother at the base of a balcony. That was the equation she carried. She didn't know what had happened in the hours between, who had said what, who had gone where, what the darkness on that balcony had actually looked like. She only knew the beginning and the end, and in the absence of any other explanation, she filled the space between them with herself. Diane made sure of that. She was at the door the very next morning with a casserole dish covered in foil and eyes red from what appeared to be genuine grief. She held Thomas for a long moment in the doorway. She ruffled Sarah's hair. And in the weeks that followed, she was present in that total, seamless way she had always been, except now her presence wasn't supplementary. Now it was structural. Thomas leaned on her in the way of a man whose foundation has been knocked loose. And Diane held him up with both hands, and a patience that looked to everyone watching like pure devotion. With Thomas occupied by grief, she turned her quiet attention to Sarah. She never raised her voice. She never said anything that could be repeated and condemned. She operated in the register of concern, the furrowed brow, the gentle hand on the shoulder, the sigh that arrived just before the words. "Your mother made choices that hurt this family, Sarah. You were just being a good daughter. Try not to think about it. These things are complicated. Adults do things children can't always understand. You couldn't have known what would happen. Nobody blames you. Nobody blames you." Said often enough, and with enough practice, sorrow becomes its own kind of accusation. Sarah was 9 years old. She thought about nothing else. Chapter 3. The Making of a Ghost. The years that followed Helen's death were not dramatic. That was the thing nobody told you about a childhood shaped by manipulation. It didn't look like suffering from the outside. It looked like a quiet girl, a well-behaved girl, a girl who had learned, early and thoroughly, that the safest thing she could do was take up as little space as possible. Sarah moved through Harlow estate like a tenant rather than a daughter. She ate her meals, completed her schoolwork, helped with the ranch without being asked. She was polite to visitors and obedient with adults, and never under any circumstances caused a scene. The ranch hands called her a good kid. Her teachers called her self-contained. Thomas, on the rare occasions he was asked about her, said she was fine. Nobody looked closely enough to see that she was disappearing. Diane looked closely. Diane always looked closely. But what Diane saw, she used. The campaign she ran against Sarah over those years was never something that could be pointed to and named. There were no locked doors or raised voices, no cruelties that left visible marks. Diane operated entirely in the space between words, in the pause before a sentence, in the sigh that preceded a compliment, in the specific way she angled her concern so that it landed like a verdict. She would say things like, "I worry about you, Sarah. You carry so much inside." Your mother was the same way. She could never really let things go either. The comparison to Helen was always there, always carefully placed. Helen, in Diane's retelling, had become a woman defined by her flaws, unstable, secretive, not quite right beneath the surface. And Sarah, according to the same quiet narrative, had inherited those flaws like a birthright. She told Thomas, in the measured tones of someone delivering difficult news with great reluctance, that Sarah might benefit from speaking to someone professional, a therapist, someone equipped to help her process the complicated feelings surrounding her mother's death. Thomas agreed because it seemed like the responsible thing to do, and because it was easier to defer to Diane on matters of the household than to examine them himself. So Sarah went to therapy, and Diane made sure the right people in Crestfield County knew about it. Not loudly, never loudly, but in the particular way that information moves through small communities when someone with good manners and a concerned expression mentions it in the right rooms. Meanwhile, Diane continued to make herself indispensable to Thomas. She managed the estate's finances with meticulous care, organizing accounts that Thomas had always found tedious, corresponding with lawyers and suppliers and creditors on his behalf. She ran the household with quiet efficiency. She was at his side at every social function, at every meeting, at every dinner where a man in Thomas's position needed someone capable and presentable beside him. She never pushed. She never declared herself. She simply ensured, with extraordinary patience, that there was no space in Thomas Harlow's life that she did not occupy. Thomas did not fall in love with Diane, but he came to depend on her in a way that looked, from the outside, like something close to it. And for Diane, dependence was enough. Dependence was, in fact, preferable. A man who needed you could not afford to lose you. The only part of Sarah's life that Diane could not immediately reach was Caleb Mercer. Caleb was 14 when Sarah first started spending real time with him, the summer 2 years after Helen died. He was the youngest son of the Mercer family, whose ranch shared a long fence line with the eastern boundary of Harlow land. He was not remarkable looking, medium height, dark hair, the kind of tan that came from actual outdoor work rather than leisure. What was remarkable about him was the quality of his attention. He listened the way very few people listen, without waiting for his turn to speak, without assembling his response while you were still talking. He never treated Sarah like someone damaged. He knew about her mother, everyone in the county did, but he didn't carry that knowledge into every conversation the way other people did, tilting their heads slightly when they looked at her, choosing their words with that careful, exhausting delicacy. Caleb just talked to her. About the ranch, about the horses, about the books he was reading, and the places he wanted to see eventually. He asked her opinions and took them seriously. He argued with her when he disagreed and laughed when she was funny, and sat in companionable silence when neither of them had anything to say. They rode across the land together in the long afternoon hours, following the fence lines and the creek beds, covering miles of Crestfield County on horseback, while the light shifted from gold to amber to the deep blue of early evening. Sarah laughed differently around him, not the polite social laugh she had cultivated for rooms full of adults, but the real one, sudden, a little too loud, the kind that surprised her when it came out. For the first time since she was 9 years old, she existed somewhere outside her own guilt. The love between them grew the way things grow when nobody is forcing them, slowly, and then all at once, and then so naturally that it was difficult to remember a time before it. They never made grand declarations, they didn't need to. It lived in the way he waited for her at the fence line every afternoon without being asked, and the way she started getting there earlier each time without admitting why. Diane noticed. She noticed because Diane noticed everything that moved in the orbit of Harlow Estate, and what she saw in Caleb Mercer was not a teenage boy with a harmless crush. She saw a threat. Caleb saw Sarah clearly, saw her as innocent, loved her without condition, and was the one person in her life who consistently reflected back to her a version of herself that had nothing to do with her mother's death. If Sarah held on to that, if she grew into herself inside that kind of love, she would eventually become someone with enough ground beneath her feet to start asking questions. Diane could not allow that, but she was patient. She always played a long game. The opportunity came the night of Thomas's 50th birthday party, when she chose a crowded room and a group of the county's most well-connected women, and said what she said about Sarah's therapy and Sarah's instability and Sarah's guilt. With Margaret Price's arm under her hand and the right people positioned to carry the story forward, the room went quiet. Sarah stood in the middle of it. Thomas looked at the floor, and Caleb reached for Sarah's hand, which Sarah pulled away because she was 17, and she had already learned that needing comfort was another form of weakness, another thing to be ashamed of. 3 weeks later, Diane paid a visit to William Mercer. Nobody ever learned the precise content of that conversation. William Mercer was a private man, and he died some years later without discussing it. What was known was that within a month of that visit, Caleb was enrolled in a university 4 states away, and departure was presented as settled, non-negotiable, and in his best interest. The night before he left, Caleb stood at the fence line between their properties in the dark and told Sarah that he didn't want to go, that something felt wrong about the whole thing, that he would write to her. Sarah stood on her side of the fence and felt the cold, formless thing in her chest expand until it filled her entirely. She told him to go. She told him it was fine. She told him they were young and he had things to do, and so did she. She watched his truck disappear down the dirt road toward the Mercer house, and then she stood at that fence for a long time in the dark, alone, because at 17, she still believed that letting people leave before they could choose to was a form of self-protection. Caleb did write to her, He wrote once a week for the first month, then twice a week, then letters that arrived, or should have arrived, with an urgency that increased as the silence from Sarah's end stretched longer and longer. He wrote about missing her, and about the flat, unfamiliar landscape of the university town, and about how nothing felt right without the particular quality of her company. He wrote things he had never said out loud, because somehow the distance made them easier. None of it reached her. Diane collected the letters from the mailbox at the end of the Harlow drive, with the same calm efficiency she applied to everything else. She didn't destroy them immediately. She kept them for a time in a box in her room, perhaps as insurance, perhaps out of something she would never have named as sentiment. Eventually they disappeared. What mattered was that Sarah never saw them. What Sarah received in place of letters was silence. She interpreted that silence the way a girl who has spent years being told she is too much and not enough will always interpret silence, as confirmation. He had gone and he had not written, and that meant what she had always suspected, that she was not worth staying for. At 18, she stopped waiting. At 18, she packed a single bag, kissed her father's cheek at the kitchen door while he drank his morning coffee, and told him she needed to build something of her own. Thomas looked at her over the rim of his cup with an expression she could not fully read. Something between relief and grief, or perhaps just the particular blankness of a man who had long since outsourced his emotional responses to someone else. He told her to drive safely. Diane stood in the doorway of the hallway behind him, hands folded, expression composed. She watched Sarah walk to her car with the stillness of someone who has just watched the last obstacle remove itself voluntarily. Sarah did not look back. She drove away from Harlow Estate in the thin early light of an October morning, the fields grey and damp on either side of the road, and she told herself she was leaving, that this was a choice, that she was moving towards something rather than running from something. She was 18 years old and she believed every word of it. Chapter 4. The Woman Who Came Back. 7 years is long enough to build a life. It is not always long enough to build a self. Sarah had constructed both, and she knew the difference between them. The life was real and solid and hers in every practical sense. She had spent her first year away from Harlow working for an agricultural management company in the city of Delbrook, learning the financial side of ranching from the outside in, the numbers, the logistics, the particular vulnerabilities of family-owned land operations that had been running on tradition longer than on strategy. She was good at it in the way people are good at things they approach without sentiment. She had no nostalgia for the ranching world, no romanticized version of it clouding her analysis. She just saw what was there. By 22, she had her own small client list. By 24, she had registered her firm, Harlow Consulting, a name she chose with the particular stubbornness of someone determined to reclaim something rather than abandon it. By 25, she had 6 full-time clients, a modest office in Delbrook, and a reputation in the regional agricultural community as someone who was precise, reliable, and refreshingly free of the ego that plagued most consultants in her field. She had a life, a clean, functional, carefully constructed life. What she did not have was anyone who knew her completely. She had colleagues she respected, and clients who trusted her, and a neighbor named Patrice who brought her soup when she was sick and asked no probing questions. She had surface friendships, pleasant, warm, contained. She had learned, without fully realizing she was learning it, that intimacy was a form of risk, and she had become very good at managing risk. She did not talk about Harlow. She did not talk about her mother or her father, or the woman who had spent years whispering her name in the wrong rooms. She had filed all of it into a part of herself she did not open, the way you close a room in a house that needs work and simply don't go in there. It was manageable, it was in fact fine. And then the phone rang on a Tuesday morning in October, and the voice on the other end was Dr. Ellison from Crestfield County Medical, and the word stroke arrived in her ear with the particular bluntness of medical professionals delivering news to family members they have never met. Thomas was stable, but he was diminished. The estate was in trouble, accounts in disarray, operational decisions deferred for months, the ranch running on the institutional memory of long-time employees rather than any coherent management. Someone needed to come. Sarah sat with the phone in her hand for a long time after the call ended. Then she booked a flight. She drove a rental car through Crestfield County on a grey November afternoon and felt the landscape recognize her before she recognized it. The particular quality of the light over flat ranch land, the smell of dry grass and distant rain, the way the sky here was wider than it was anywhere else she had lived. She had forgotten that, or she had chosen to forget it. Harlow Estate came into view at the end of the long unpaved drive the way it always had, slowly, through a line of old oaks, the main house emerging in sections rather than all at once. It looked smaller than she remembered, or perhaps she was simply larger. She sat in the car for a moment before getting out. Diane was in the doorway before Sarah had finished climbing the porch steps. She was older. Of course she was older, 7 years had passed, but she wore it the way she wore everything, with careful management. Her hair was silver now rather than dark blonde, and it suited her. She was dressed simply and well. Her eyes were wet before Sarah had even reached her, which was either genuine emotion or a very practiced entrance, and Sarah had long since lost the ability to tell the difference. She opened her arms. Sarah walked into them and accepted the embrace with her eyes open, her chin resting on Diane's shoulder, looking past her into the interior of the house she had grown up in. The hallway, the wooden floor, the coat hooks by the door, with Thomas's hat still hanging on the same one it had always occupied. She held Diane for exactly as long as was necessary, and then stepped back. She was civil. She was watchful. She had arrived with no declared agenda and no visible hostility, and she intended to keep it that way for as long as it served her. Thomas was in the downstairs bedroom that had been converted for his recovery. He was awake when she came in, propped against pillows, thinner than she remembered, and with a stillness about him that the stroke had installed where his particular brand of restless authority used to live. His left hand didn't work well. His speech came slowly, with gaps. But his eyes were clear, and when they found Sarah in the doorway, they did something she hadn't expected. They filled. She sat with him for an hour that first afternoon. They didn't say much. There wasn't a language available to them for what needed to be said, and they were both too accustomed to silence to force one. But she held his good hand for a while, and he let her, and that was more than they had managed in the last several years of phone calls that got shorter every time. She spent her first 2 days quietly assessing the estate situation. The financial picture was worse than she had expected, not catastrophically, but neglected in the way things get neglected when the person nominally in charge has spent years deferring to someone else. Accounts that should have been straightforward had become complicated. Vendors hadn't been paid on schedule. A tax filing had been missed. The operational management of the ranch itself was being held together by the ranch foreman, a weathered man named Gil, who had worked Harlow land for 30 years and who looked at Sarah on her first morning with an expression of barely concealed relief. On her third day back, she drove the eastern boundary of the property to assess the fence line condition. The Mercer Ranch sat on the other side of that fence, as it always had. The main house was visible from the road, a well-kept property, the kind that had been maintained with consistent attention rather than intermittent bursts of investment. There was smoke coming from the chimney. She almost kept driving. She didn't. She pulled over at the boundary gate and sat for a moment, and then she got out of the car because she was 25 years old and she had driven 4 states to stop running from things, and this was a fence line she had ridden 1,000 times as a girl, and the smoke from that chimney meant someone was home, and she was tired of choosing avoidance. She found Caleb in the yard beside the barn, checking the undercarriage of a truck with the focused attention of someone who prefers to diagnose problems directly rather than guess at them. He straightened when he heard her approach and turned, and for a moment they both stood in the particular way of people who have a great deal of history and insufficient vocabulary for it. He looked like himself. Older in the ways that outdoor work makes a person older, weathered at the edges, settled in the body, but unmistakably himself. The quality of his attention had not changed at all. It landed on her the same way it always had, fully, without agenda. He said her name, she said his. They talked for a while about the practical things first, his father's death a few years back, his decision to return and take over the Mercer Ranch, her consulting firm, her father's condition. The conversation had the slightly careful quality of two people finding the edges of something before they decide whether to touch it. And then he stopped, looked at her directly in the way he had always been able to do without it feeling like an intrusion, and said, "I wrote to you. For 2 years I wrote to you." Sarah went still. Not the performative stillness she had learned for rooms full of people. The real kind. The kind that happens when something reaches past every defense you have built and lands directly on the thing underneath. She looked at him for a long moment. "I never received a single letter," she said. The sentence sat between them in the cold November air. Neither of them said what it implied. They didn't need to. They had both grown up in Crestfield County, and they both knew who managed the Harlow mailbox for the better part of a decade. The conversation ended shortly after. There was nothing more to say yet, just the implication sitting there, enormous and quiet, waiting for someone to be ready to pull on it. Sarah drove back to Harlow Estate with both hands tight on the wheel and something moving in her chest that she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not grief, not guilt, something sharper than both of those. She went directly to the estate's records room. She had been in there the previous day to assess the financial situation and had catalogued what she found with the analytical detachment of a professional. Now she looked with different eyes. She pulled ledgers from the shelf in order of year and spread them across the table and went through them with the patient, methodical focus that had built her career. What she found didn't announce itself. It accumulated. Money moved through accounts she didn't recognize, modest amounts, moved with enough regularity to suggest intention rather than error. A life insurance policy on Helen, legitimately claimed by Thomas in the year of her death, administered through a law firm called Colwell and Associates, a name she had to read 3 times before the implication fully assembled itself. Old estate planning documents with pages that didn't correspond to the numbering of the pages around them. Gaps where there should have been continuity. None of it was conclusive. A good lawyer could explain away any single piece of it. But Sarah had spent 7 years reading the financial stories of family-owned properties, and she knew what intentional looked like beneath the surface of accidental. She closed the ledgers and sat in the records room for a long time. The next morning she came downstairs to find Diane already at the kitchen table with Thomas, cutting his toast into quarters, the way you do for someone whose hands don't work reliably. Thomas was looking at Diane with the expression of a man who has come to understand dependence as a form of love. Sarah poured her coffee and said good morning and gave nothing away. 2 days later, Diane came to find her. Sarah was in the records room again, cross-referencing vendor invoices, when she heard the door open behind her. She closed the ledger she was reading before she turned around. Diane stood in the doorway. She was wearing her concerned expression, the one with the slightly furrowed brow and the soft mouth. She looked at the ledgers spread across the table, and then at Sarah, and then back at the ledgers, and something behind her eyes did a quick, controlled calculation. She said, "I've been thinking about you since you arrived, Sarah, about how hard this must be, coming back after so long, seeing your father this way." Sarah said nothing. Diane took a step into the room. "Your father relies on me. This household relies on me. I want you to know that I understand why you're here and I have no interest in conflict, but I've protected this family for 30 years. She paused. "I suggest you remember who was here when you weren't." She left the room as quietly as she had entered it. Sarah sat with the silence for a moment. Then she went upstairs and pulled her suitcase from the top of the wardrobe and put it on the bed and began to fold things into it with the efficient, automatic movements of someone running a familiar program. She had the bag half packed when she heard footsteps on the stairs. Caleb appeared in the doorway of her room. He looked at the suitcase on the bed and then at her face, and he didn't say anything for a moment. He leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed, in no apparent hurry. Then he said, "You've been running from something you didn't do your entire life. Don't let her win again." Sarah stopped folding. She stood with a sweater in her hands and looked at the wall in front of her and felt the truth of those words move through her in a long, slow wave. Nobody had ever said it to her that plainly. Not a therapist, not a friend, not anyone. Just this man standing in a doorway, saying the thing that was true without dressing it up or softening it or making it easier to dismiss. She set the sweater down on the bed. She looked at the suitcase for a long moment. Then she began to unpack it. Chapter 5. Martha. It was Gil who mentioned Martha. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without preamble, while checking feed inventory in the barn on a Thursday morning. Sarah had been asking him, carefully and without revealing why, about people who had worked closely with Diane over the years, people who had known the family before Helen died, people who might remember things. Gil thought about it for a moment, the way he thought about everything, with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who had learned that most problems benefited from not being rushed. Then he said, "There was a woman named Martha Gaines. Worked for Diane for a long time. Longer than I've been here. She's at Pinewood now, I think, the care facility off Route 9. He went back to counting feed bags. Sarah stood in the barn doorway for a moment, looking out at the grey November fields. She had not gone looking for Martha. She had been pulling on threads, the financial records, the law firm name, the intercepted letters, following each one to its logical next point, with the methodical patience of someone who has learned to trust process over instinct. But instinct was what took her to Pinewood Care Facility on a Friday afternoon, alone without telling anyone where she was going. The facility was a low, well-kept building, set back from Route 9 behind a line of pine trees that gave it its name. The lobby smelled of floor cleaner and something floral, not unpleasant, just institutional in the way all such places are, the smell of people being cared for efficiently and with limited resources for beauty. A nurse at the front desk directed her down a corridor to a room near the end of the east wing. Sarah knocked on the open door. Martha Gaines was smaller than Sarah had expected, though she couldn't have said what she had expected. She was somewhere in her late 70s, white-haired, with the particular translucence of someone whose body had been spending its reserves for some time. She was sitting up in bed with a book open in her lap that she didn't appear to be reading. When Sarah appeared in the doorway, Martha looked up. The recognition was immediate. Martha's eyes found Sarah's face and stayed there, and something in her expression shifted. A complicated movement, not quite fear and not quite relief. The look of someone who's been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has just seen the person they were meant to give it to. She asked Sarah to come in. She asked if she was alone. Sarah said yes. Martha closed the book in her lap and set it on the bedside table and folded her hands over the blanket and looked at them for a moment. Her hands were trembling, finely, the way old hands do, though Sarah had the sense that what she was seeing was not entirely attributable to age. She said, "I've thought about this for 20 years, about whether I would say anything, and to whom, and when. I used to tell myself it wasn't my place, that I hadn't seen enough to be certain, that it would only cause more pain." She looked up at Sarah. "But I'm dying, and I find that the things you've told yourself for years start to sound different when you don't have years left." Sarah sat in the chair beside the bed and said nothing. She had learned in 7 years of professional work and a lifetime of listening that the most important thing you could do when someone was preparing to tell you something difficult was to make as little noise as possible. Martha told her about the night Helen died. She had been at the Harlow estate that evening. She was there often in those years. Diane frequently brought her along when she was spending extended time at the Harlow house, using her to help with household tasks that required an extra pair of hands. That night, Martha had been in the kitchen washing dishes when she heard the voices move from inside the house to the upper landing. She knew Diane's voice. She had known it for decades. The other voice was Helen's. Martha could not hear the specific words at first, just the quality of them, the particular cadence of two women having a conversation that had moved beyond the reach of ordinary restraint. She had dried her hands on a dish towel and stood very still in the kitchen, listening without meaning to, the way you listen when something in the air tells you the situation has changed. Then Diane's voice came down clearly, sharp and stripped of its usual elegance. "He will never choose you over me, not after tonight." A silence, and then a sound that Martha had never been able to describe to herself in the years since except as wrong. Not a scream, not a crash, just a sound that did not belong in the nighttime vocabulary of a house, and that she understood immediately and completely without needing to see what had caused it. She had not gone outside. She had stood in the kitchen with the dish towel in her hands, and she had not moved. By the time the household was roused, and the discovery was made, and the terrible quiet spread through Harlow estate, Martha was seated at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she didn't remember making. She told herself she hadn't seen anything. She told herself she wasn't certain. She told herself she had a daughter to feed and a job she could not afford to lose, and that certainty was required before a person destroyed another person's life with an accusation. She told herself these things for 20 years. Sarah sat with all of it for a moment after Martha stopped speaking. The room was very quiet. Outside the window, the pine trees moved in a light wind. Then she said carefully, "You said, not after tonight." What did that mean? What had happened that night? Martha nodded slowly. She had expected the question. She told Sarah about the afternoon, how Diane had positioned Helen to be found in Raymond's arms, how she had described it to Martha afterward with a precision that made clear it had been planned, that the timing of Raymond's presence and the comment that made Helen cry and the moment that brought Sarah down that hallway had not been coincidence. Diane had been constructing that afternoon for weeks, waiting for the right conditions. She had used Sarah, a 9-year-old girl. She had used her as the instrument of her own mother's destruction, and had then spent the next decade ensuring that Sarah believed she had done it herself. The cold that moved through Sarah in that moment was not like grief and not like anger. It was something older than both, the specific sensation of a weight you have carried so long, you stopped noticing it suddenly revealing its full size. She sat with it. Martha reached toward the bedside table and opened the drawer. She removed an envelope, old, the paper slightly yellowed at the edges, sealed and addressed in handwriting that Sarah recognized before she had consciously processed the recognition. She would have known her mother's handwriting anywhere. She had spent years as a child tracing the letters of it in old birthday cards, trying to hold on to a voice she couldn't remember clearly enough. The envelope was addressed to Thomas. Martha pressed it into Sarah's hands and held them for a moment, her trembling fingers wrapped around Sarah's steadier ones, and said, "She gave it to me the afternoon before she died. She was frightened. She asked me to make sure Thomas received it if anything happened to her. I told myself afterward that I'd tried, that I'd left it somewhere he might find it. But I hadn't. I had kept it. Because I was afraid of what it would mean if I gave it to him, afraid of what Diane would do." She paused. "I'm sorry, child. I am so deeply sorry." Sarah drove back to Harlow estate with the envelope on the passenger seat. She didn't open it until she had parked the car at the end of the long, oak-lined drive and turned off the engine and sat in the particular silence of a property that has no idea its foundations are about to shift. The fields were darkening around her. The lights of the main house were warm and yellow in the early evening. She broke the seal carefully. Helen's letter was 4 pages long, written in the unhurried hand of someone who was frightened, but had decided to be precise rather than panicked. She began by telling Thomas that she loved him, and that what she was about to write was not meant as accusation but as record. A record she hoped he would never need to read, and was making only because she had begun to feel over the preceding weeks that something was building toward a point she couldn't see clearly. She described Diane, not as a monster, as a woman, a specific woman with a specific wound, one that had begun decades ago when Thomas had chosen Helen without understanding what it cost Diane. Helen wrote that she had not seen it clearly herself for years, had told herself it was ordinary jealousy, the kind that fades. But it hadn't faded, it had organized itself. It had become structural, woven into the fabric of their household, their social life, their marriage, in ways that Helen had only recently begun to trace back to their source. She described the whispered comments, the social maneuvers, the way Diane had over the years subtly repositioned herself as indispensable to Thomas and unreliable to Helen, so that whenever Helen tried to raise her concerns with her husband, she sounded like a jealous woman attacking a devoted friend. She wrote that she had tried to create distance between their family and Diane on 3 separate occasions, and that each time, Thomas had responded with genuine bewilderment, asking her why she wanted to isolate them from someone who had done nothing but give. Helen understood by the time she wrote the letter that Diane had engineered precisely this dynamic, that the years of devotion and service had been, among other things, an insurance policy against exactly this moment, the moment Helen tried to tell the truth and found that the truth had been preemptively discredited. She wrote, "I am not certain what she is capable of. I only know that she has never accepted the life she has here as a visitor to ours. I believe she has always wanted it for herself, and I believe that what she wants, she finds ways to take." The final page was short. Helen wrote that she was leaving the letter with Martha for safekeeping, that she hoped Thomas would read it and understand, and that whatever happened, she wanted him to know that their marriage and their daughter were the best things in her life, and that she had never, not for a single day, taken either of them for granted. She signed it with her name. Sarah folded the letter back along its original creases and returned it to the envelope. She held it in both hands and looked through the windshield at the warm lights of the house. She had spent 16 years carrying a guilt that Diane had custom-built for her and installed in her at age 9 with a kneel and a whisper and a single carefully chosen question. She had grown up believing she had caused her mother's death. She had left the only home she had ever known because she believed the home was better without her. She had interpreted 7 years of silence from a man who loved her as confirmation of her own unworthiness, not knowing that the silence had been manufactured. She sat in the car until the last light faded from the sky. Then she picked up her phone and called Caleb. She didn't tell him everything. She said, "I need you to come to Harlow tomorrow morning. I need a witness." He said, "I'll be there at 7. She went inside. She ate dinner. She was civil to Diane over the meal in the particular way she had been civil since her return, present, contained, giving nothing away. Diane watched her across the table with the faint alertness of someone waiting for a signal. Sarah gave her nothing to read. She went to bed early and lay in the dark of her childhood room and listened to the house settle around her, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, the weight in her chest felt not heavier but different, transformed, the way raw material transforms when it finally finds its purpose. She was not guilty. She had never been guilty. She had been 9 years old, and someone had used her precisely and deliberately as a tool. Tomorrow, she was going to say so out loud. Chapter 6. The Confrontation. Caleb arrived at 7, as he said he would. Sarah met him at the door before he could knock, and they stood on the porch for a moment in the cold morning air while she told him what she needed him to do, not to intervene, not to speak unless spoken to, just to be present, a witness, a steady thing in the room, someone whose account of the morning could not be dismissed or rewritten afterward. He listened without interrupting. Then he nodded once. They went inside. Diane was already in the kitchen, moving through her morning routine with the unhurried efficiency that had always made her presence in the Harlow household feel inevitable rather than chosen. Coffee on the stove. Thomas's medication laid out in the small ceramic dish she had designated for it. The radio on low. She turned when she heard them come in and took in the sight of Sarah and Caleb together in the doorway with a brief, controlled assessment that she converted immediately into a warm smile. She said good morning. She asked Caleb if he would like coffee. Sarah said, "I need to speak with you in the main hall, Diane. Now please." Something shifted in Diane's expression. Not fear yet, just a heightened attention, the alertness of someone recalibrating. She set down the coffee pot and smoothed the front of her blouse and said, of course, in the voice she used when she was performing reasonableness. They walked to the main hall. It was the same room it had always been, wide planked floors, high ceilings, the long windows that faced east and filled the space with morning light. The room where Thomas had hosted 30 years of county gatherings. The room where Sarah had stood at 17 in a pale blue dress while the crowd went quiet around her. She had thought about that when she chose this room. She had chosen it deliberately, the way Diane had always chosen her settings deliberately. She placed Helen's letter on the side table. She placed Martha's signed testimony beside it. Both documents lay in the morning light. The yellowed envelope and the crisp white pages Martha had allowed Sarah to have witnessed and signed at the care facility the previous day, with a notary Sarah had driven out to meet that same evening. Diane looked at them. Then she looked at Sarah. Sarah said, "I want you out of this house by morning." The silence that followed was different from the silences Diane usually generated. Those were controlled, deployed with purpose, shaped to serve her. This one she did not choose. It happened to her. And in it, for the first time in Sarah's memory, Diane Colwell looked her actual age. Then the composure reassembled itself. Diane said gently, "Sarah, I understand you're under a great deal of stress. Coming back here, seeing your father this way, going through old records, it can make a person look for explanations where there aren't any." She moved toward the table, not to look at the documents, but to stand near them, as though proximity were a form of authority. "Your mother's death was a tragedy. It was an accident. I know this family's grief better than anyone alive." Sarah said nothing. She waited. "I loved your mother," Diane said. The word landed with a practiced weight. "Whatever you think you've found, whatever that woman told you, Martha was never a reliable person, Sarah. She was always prone to confusion. She's elderly and she's ill, and I'm sure she believes everything she said to you, but belief and truth are not the same thing." Sarah watched her. "And that letter," Diane continued, her voice softening further, "was written by a woman who was frightened and confused, and who had convinced herself of a story that wasn't true. Your mother had a... She struggled, Sarah. You know this. You've always known this. She saw threats that weren't there." She paused. She looked at Sarah with an expression of such layered, practiced compassion that a person who didn't know her well would have felt the pull of it. "I have given 30 years of my life to this family," she said. 30 years. When your mother died, I held this household together. When you left, I stayed. When your father needed someone, I was here. I have asked for nothing. I have taken nothing." Her voice carried a tremor now that seemed genuine, or had been rehearsed so many times it had become genuine. "And this is what I'm met with. Documents and accusations from a dying woman who spent her whole life doing whatever I asked." Sarah let her finish. Then she said very quietly, "The law firm that administered my mother's life insurance policy Colwell and Associates. That's your mother's maiden name. Diane went still. The accounts the estate funds were moved through between 2004 and 2009. I've traced 4 of them. They lead to the same holding company, registered in a county 2 states over. I haven't finished tracing the other 3 yet. Sarah kept her voice level. And the estate trust in my mother's name, the land she inherited from her family, you've been keeping its documentation buried for 20 years. I found the original filing 3 days ago in a box in the records room behind ledgers from 1987. The softness left Diane's face. Not all at once. In layers, like watching something that has been constructed carefully over a long time take itself apart in a matter of seconds. The compassionate furrow, the trembling lip, the wet eyes. All of it fell away, and what was underneath was something Sarah had never seen on Diane's face before, because Diane had never before been in a room where her version of events was not the one with the most purchase. She tried the soft weapons one more time. The history, the devotion, the years of service. She spoke of Thomas and what he needed, and what Sarah clearly didn't understand about the complexity of a household managed over decades. Her voice had a different quality now, higher and faster, the cadence of someone talking to fill space rather than to persuade. Sarah stood and listened, and said nothing, and waited. And then Diane stopped pretending. She straightened. Something cold moved through her expression, not cruelty exactly, but the particular hardness of someone who has decided that performance is no longer worth the effort. Your mother, she said, was not the woman you've spent your life mourning. She was weak, she was ungrateful. She had everything, this house, this land, this family, and she didn't have the sense or the grace to hold on to it. Her voice was flat now, stripped of ornament. I loved Thomas before she ever existed. I was here first. And everything I did, every single thing I did for him, because he deserved someone who would actually fight for what they had, instead of weeping in another man's arms at the first difficulty. The room was completely silent. I don't expect you to understand that, Diane said. You're too much like her. It was, Sarah would think later, the most honest thing Diane had ever said in this house. And then Diane's eyes moved to the doorway. Caleb was standing there. He had been there since they entered the room, still quiet, positioned exactly where Sarah had asked him to be. His expression was unreadable in the way of someone containing a great deal behind a deliberate calm. He had heard every word from the moment they walked in. He had heard the documents named and the accounts described, and the firm identified. He had heard Diane abandon her performance and speak in her own voice for the first time. Diane looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at Sarah, and something behind her eyes did a fast final calculation. She left the room without another word. Sarah heard her footsteps on the stairs, the sound of a door, then the particular silence of a house that is holding its breath. She stood in the main hall with the morning light coming through the east windows and looked at her mother's letter on the table. She picked it up and held it for a moment. Then she went to find her father. Thomas was awake, propped against his pillows, his good hand resting on the blanket. He looked at Sarah when she came in and seemed to read something in her face because he straightened slightly, and the vague, medicated placidity that had softened his expression since his stroke gave way to something more present. Sarah pulled the chair close to his bed and sat down. She said, "I'm going to read you something, Dad. I need you to listen to all of it before you say anything." He nodded. She opened the envelope and unfolded the 4 pages and smoothed them flat against her knee. She looked at her mother's handwriting for a moment. The careful, unhurried letters, the even lines, the particular way Helen had always formed her capital T's, like small flags. Then she began to read. Thomas listened. She read all 4 pages without stopping, her voice steady and even throughout, the way she had learned to deliver difficult information over 7 years of professional practice. She did not editorialize. She did not pause to explain or contextualize. She simply gave her father his wife's words in the order Helen had written them, from the declaration of love at the beginning to the quiet, precise fear at the end. When she finished, she folded the letter back along its creases and set it on the blanket beside his hand. Thomas did not speak for a long time. When he did, his voice came out broken in the specific way of speech impaired by stroke and by something older and less clinical: grief that has been compressed for 2 decades, suddenly finding the only exit available to it. He said, "I didn't know." Sarah looked at him. She believed him. That was the terrible thing. She believed him completely, and it gave her no relief. Her father had not been a villain. He had been a proud and credulous man who loved the wrong person's version of events and had never had the imagination or the courage to question it. He had looked at the flaw at his own daughter's moment of greatest humiliation. He had let a 9-year-old child carry a guilt that was never hers. He had outsourced his grief and his household and eventually his judgment to a woman who had been stealing from him in every sense of the word for 30 years. He had not known. And not knowing had cost them everything. She did not comfort him. She did not rage at him either, because rage required an energy she had spent years keeping in reserve for her own survival, and she was tired of spending herself on other people's reckonings. She sat with him in silence for a while. She let him weep without comment. She looked out the window at the fields. Her mother's fields, she now knew, part of them legally, and actually her mother's. And she let herself feel the full, unedited weight of everything that had been taken. Her mother, her childhood, the years at Harlow she should have had, the letters she should have received, the girl she might have been if a woman with pearl earrings and a patient smile had not decided, before Sarah could form her first complete memory, that the Harlow life belonged to her. She felt it all. She did not push any of it away. After a while, she stood and picked up the letter from the blanket where she had left it. She put it back in its envelope carefully. She went to the window and looked out. Down on the drive, a car was moving. Moving fast, pulling out from beside the house, spitting gravel, accelerating toward the road at the end of the Oak Line Drive. Diane's car, moving with the urgency of someone who had made a decision and was committed to it. Sarah watched it go. She picked up her phone and called the Crestfield County Sheriff's Department. She gave her name. She gave the address. She said that she had documented evidence related to a 20-year-old death investigation and recent financial fraud, and that the primary subject had just left the property and was likely attempting to leave the county. The deputy on the other end asked her to stay on the line. Sarah stood at the window and watched the dust settle on the long drive where Diane's car had been, the old oaks standing on either side of it, the way they always had, patient and indifferent and older than everyone's trouble. She stayed on the line. Chapter 7. The Balcony. They found Diane 3 days later. Not far, as it turned out. 2 counties over, at a bus station in the small transit hub of Mallory Creek, a town that had a Greyhound stop and a diner and not much else. The kind of place you passed through rather than arrived at. A security camera above the ticket window caught her on a Tuesday morning, standing at the counter in a dark coat with her hair pulled back, purchasing a ticket under the name Carol Weston. The transaction took 4 minutes. By the time the deputy on duty reviewed the footage, Diane had been sitting in an interview room at the Crestfield County Sheriff's Department for 6 hours. The woman who was brought back to Crestfield was not the woman Sarah had grown up watching move through rooms with the serene authority of someone who has never doubted her right to be there. That composure, the pearl earrings, the folded hands, the expression of practiced concern, had not survived 3 days on the run and a bus station in Mallory Creek. What the deputies returned to Harlow County was a woman who looked, for the first time in Sarah's memory, like what she actually was. Someone who had been performing a version of herself for so long that without the performance, there was very little underneath. Sarah was not present for the arrest. She had been advised by the sheriff's deputy assigned to the case, a straightforward woman named Vasquez, who seemed to find the entire situation neither surprising nor extraordinary, which Sarah found oddly comforting. To let the process work without her direct involvement. There would be time for her testimony. There would be hearings and filings, and the slow, unglamorous machinery of a legal case that was going to take considerably longer than a single dramatic moment to resolve. But word traveled in Crestfield County the way it always had, faster than news and slower than rumor, through the particular network of ranch families and county workers and people who had grown up knowing each other's business, whether they wanted to or not. By the end of that week, the story had reached every table in the county. The ranch hands at Harlow Estate heard it from their counterparts at neighboring properties. The women who had stood in this same house at Thomas Harlow's 50th birthday party heard it over coffee and telephone calls, and the specific frequency of stunned disbelief that accompanies the revelation that the thing you sensed but never named was real after all. The version of Helen Harlow that Diane had spent years constructing, unstable, ungrateful, a woman who had brought her own tragedy upon herself, began in the space of a week to quietly dismantle. The ranch hands stopped repeating it. The county families reassembled their recollections of Helen with new context and found that she had been, as most people who are spoken of poorly by someone with an agenda turn out to have been, simply a woman, warm and real and wronged. Sarah watched all of this from a careful distance. She had things to do. The financial investigation that Vasquez's department opened, in conjunction with a forensic accountant from the county prosecutor's office, confirmed what Sarah had traced in the records room. Money moved systematically over a period of years through accounts connected to Diane. Amounts modest enough to avoid obvious scrutiny but consistent enough over time to constitute a significant total. The Colwell and Associates connection to Helen's life insurance administration was flagged for separate examination. The case was not simple, and Vasquez told Sarah plainly that it would not move quickly, but that the documentation she had assembled was, in the deputy's exact words, unusually thorough. Sarah thanked her and went back to work, because there was also the estate to manage. There was Thomas's recovery to oversee, and the ranch's finances to stabilize, and the operational backlog that Gil had been holding together through sheer institutional memory and stubbornness. Sarah spent the days after Diane's arrest the way she had spent the preceding weeks, methodically, practically, with the focused attention of someone who has decided that rebuilding is more useful than reckoning. She was good at rebuilding. She had been doing it in one form or another her entire adult life. Thomas's lawyer, a measured man named Aldrich, who had handled Harlow family affairs for 2 decades and who seemed to experience the revelation of Diane's actions as a personal, professional embarrassment, surfaced the matter of Helen's estate trust on a Wednesday afternoon in the downstairs study. He had, he said, been aware of the trust's existence for some years. He had raised it with Thomas on 2 occasions and been told both times that it was being handled. He had assumed, incorrectly as it now appeared, that handled meant by someone competent and in good faith. What had actually happened was that the documentation, the original filing of the trust, the asset schedules, the transfer instruments, had been systematically misfiled and in some cases physically removed from the relevant folders over a period of years, rendering the trust effectively invisible to anyone who didn't know precisely where to look for it. Sarah had found the original filing in the records room behind the 1987 ledgers. With that document recovered and the trust's existence formally reinstated, the assets transferred to Sarah as Helen's sole heir. It was not a vast fortune. Helen's family had been comfortable rather than wealthy, and the land parcels and modest financial holdings that comprised the trust were significant, primarily in their meaning rather than their magnitude. But the land was real and it was hers, and it sat adjacent to the Harlow property. in a way that, combined with her inheritance rights as Thomas's daughter, made her position at Harlow Estate not merely sentimental, but structural. She owned a piece of this land, her mother's piece of it. She sat with that for a long time after Aldrich left. The estate stabilized over the following weeks, with the efficiency of a system that had been waiting for competent management rather than requiring any particular genius. Vendors were paid. The missed tax filing was addressed. The ranch's operational calendar was reconstructed with Gil's help into something coherent and forward-looking. Sarah worked 12-hour days and slept well, and woke each morning in her childhood room with the particular clarity of someone who has finally found the thing they are supposed to be doing. Thomas improved slowly. The stroke had taken things from him that were not coming back. The authority of his physical presence, the speed of his speech, the particular confidence of a man who had never had reason to doubt his own judgment. What remained was quieter and, in some ways, more honest. He asked Sarah questions about the ranch and listened to her answers with an attention he had not, in her memory, previously applied to her opinions. He asked about her firm in Delbrook. He asked about her life there, the years away, the things she had built. He did not ask her to forgive him. She thought he understood at some level that forgiveness was not the transaction available to them, that what they had instead was time and proximity and the willingness to be in the same room without the old distances enforced between them. It was not everything, but it was something real, and Sarah was old enough to know that something real was worth more than a grand gesture. She visited Martha twice more before Martha died quietly, on a Thursday morning in early December, with her daughter beside her. Sarah sat with the daughter for a while in the facility's small family room and said that her mother had done a brave thing and that it had mattered and that she was grateful. The daughter cried. Sarah held her hand and did not tell her that it was all right, because it wasn't entirely all right, and she had spent enough of her life saying things were fine when they weren't. She drove back to Harlow in the dark and sat in the car at the end of the drive for a moment, looking at the lights of the house. Then she went inside. Diane's trial date was set for the following spring. The charges were serious: fraud, financial exploitation, and most significantly, a manslaughter charge related to Helen's death that the prosecutor's office had built carefully from Martha's testimony. The physical evidence from the original investigation that was now being re-examined, and a pattern of behavior documented extensively enough to establish intent. Sarah had been told to expect a long process, with delays and motions and the particular grinding quality of the legal system working at its own pace. She had waited 20 years for the truth. She could wait a little longer for the rest of it. On a Sunday evening in mid-December, with the temperature dropping and the first suggestion of winter moving across the Crestfield County fields, Sarah went up to the second floor of the main house and walked to the end of the corridor and pushed open the door to the balcony. She had not been out here since she returned. She had walked past the door a dozen times and felt the particular gravity of it, the awareness of what this threshold meant, what had happened on the other side of it, and she had kept walking. Not from fear exactly, more from a sense of timing, the instinct that some reclamations need to wait until you are ready to make them completely. She was ready now. The balcony was smaller than she remembered, the way all childhood spaces are smaller when you return to them as an adult. The railing was new. Thomas had had it replaced some years back, which she thought was probably the only act of acknowledgement he had been capable of at the time. The wood of the deck was cold beneath her feet. The night was clear and very dark beyond the reach of the house lights, the stars present and unhurried above the fields. She stood at the railing and looked out. The land extended in every direction, dark and quiet and enormous, the way land looks at night when there are no neighbors close enough to break the black with competing light. She could make out the fence line between Harlow and Mercer land by the slight difference in the texture of the dark, and beyond it the faint outline of the Mercer house, where a single light was burning in a downstairs window. She heard the door behind her, and knew without turning who it was. Caleb stepped out onto the balcony and stood beside her. He had been at the house for dinner, helping her go through a set of operational projections for the spring planting season, which had turned into dinner and then into the particular comfortable extension of an evening between two people who are no longer pretending that their time together is purely practical. He looked out over the land the way she was looking at it, taking it in without rushing it, the way he took in most things. They stood in silence for a while. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that belongs to people who have known each other long enough to understand that not everything needs filling. Then Caleb reached out and took her hand, not tentatively, not as a question, the way you reach for something you have been meaning to reach for a long time and have finally decided to stop finding reasons to delay. His hand was warm and certain, and she felt the contact move through her with a quiet, clarifying force. She didn't pull away. She laced her fingers through his and held on, and they stood like that at the railing of the balcony, with the dark fields stretching out before them and the cold, clean air of a Crestfield County winter moving over the land. After a while, he said quietly, without looking at her, "I would have come back sooner, if I had known you needed me." She thought about that. "I know," she said, "but I think I needed to come back for myself first." He turned and looked at her then, that full, unhurried attention that had always made her feel seen in the way that mattered. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She looked back out over the land. Her mother had loved this view. Helen had stood in rooms that faced this direction deliberately, Sarah had read in the letter, because she said the fields in the evening light were the most honest thing she knew. Sarah understood that now in a way she couldn't have before she left, and came back and found the letter, and lost the weight she had been carrying since she was 9 years old. The land was quiet. The stars were out. Somewhere across the fence line, an animal moved in the dark and was still again. Sarah exhaled, slowly and completely, and without reservation, the way you breathe when you have set something down that you carried for so long, you forgot what it felt like to be without it. She had been 9 years old when the lie was planted inside her. A woman had knelt down to her level and tucked her hair behind her ear and asked a question that was not really a question, and Sarah had carried the answer to it for 16 years without knowing she had been given a false one. She was 25 now. The balcony was just a balcony. The railing was solid beneath her hand. The man beside her was real and warm, and had been writing letters to her for 2 years that she was only now, in some sense, finally receiving. And the land, her mother's land, the land that Diane had spent 20 years trying to make her own, stretched out before her in the dark, patient and permanent and entirely, completely hers. She held Caleb's hand and looked out at it and did not look away. Sarah carried a lie for 16 years, and it almost cost her everything. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment with the moment that moved you the most, and subscribe for more stories like this one. You never know who needs it.